The COVID-19 pandemic has affected education, including at the university level, all around the world. More than ever before, students have needed to rely on their support groups. But have you ever wondered about how the educators themselves coped? Open your ears and mind, and let's chat about that. Welcome to Griffincast, a podcast where we casually chat about science coming out of the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Guelph, and how that work can affect lives around the world. I'm your host, Michael Lim. With me today, for our inaugural podcast, is special guest Dr. Dan Grunspan, and we'll be chatting about how researchers are uncovering the importance of connections in teaching teams, especially in times of stress. Welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to get to be on the inaugural episode.
And we're very excited to have you.
Yeah.
So Dan, how would you best describe your research if you met some random person on the street?
Yeah, so I think the big overarching theme is that all my research aims to improve post-secondary education. There's a lot of ways that you can do that. So you can focus on students, you can think about what instructors are doing, you can think about kind of at the higher administrative and just kind of generally in higher education. I'm not too discerning, really, I guess, in that area. I kind of am willing to embark on any work, but it tends to be, right, I want to be doing stuff that ultimately helps improve how undergraduate students learn. Then there's a bunch of other kind of, I think, like random things that I just get interested in, get pulled into, and I'll go for it. But I think that's the big overarching theme and the sorts of things that kind of, keep me up at night thinking about stuff.
So why did you decide to get into this type of research? Did you ever expect to do this when you first got into higher education?
No, not at all. Totally fell into it. And I think it's a very common story for a lot of people who end up doing research, basically education research in a post-secondary setting, because it's fairly new. So I was earning my PhD actually in biocultural anthropology. I was really interested in human evolution of human social learning. And basically what was going on at the time, I was starting to get interested in social network analysis. So I was taking a social network analysis course, and this coincided with my first time teaching at the university level as a TA. And I was doing this in a biology department, even though I was an anthropology student. And there was all kinds of education research going on in the biology department that I was TAing for. And there just kind of became this really perfect kind of confluence of things going on where I was like, hey, it'd be really cool to apply some of the social network analysis stuff, thinking about social learning in this, kind of like larger context where a lot of education research is going on. So I started doing that with a collaborator as a grad student. And then it was just like, from there, I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is like really cool and like super interesting. And then I kind of pivoted from there. So then it kind of became much more of my focus was just focused on, education, higher education, networks, things like that. And then it's, I think, spread from there.
Well, isn't that kind of usually how it ends up going, where you're pursuing something and then all of a sudden you find yourself falling into a new hole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, in some ways, right, that's the exciting thing about research is if you can find a way to make it happen, right? If you can find the funding, if you can find these things, like you can pursue the questions that, you think are really interesting and really important. So I've been lucky that I've gotten to do that.
So, I know you're relatively new to the University of Guelph, so I was curious, have you found anything different teaching at Guelph versus other universities?
It's hard for me, I think, to accurately reflect on how the University of Guelph and the department here may differ from other ones that I've seen, partially because I've entered at such a strange time. So, right, I think, the overarching, primacy of dealing with the pandemic and teaching in the pandemic and just all the things that are going on, right? It's really hard to make a fair comparison. I think what I've been really impressed with is just the engagement and how much the department and the college cares about instruction and teaching, and just that commitment. And I think that's something that I've seen pretty unmatched in a lot of places where like it really is something that matters to a lot of people, and that there's kind of respect given to it, right? Like the people don't care, right? They don't do podcasts to highlight it or anything like that, right? So I think I'm like really impressed in that regard.
Speaking of teaching during a pandemic, you recently published a study titled Instructional Communities of Practice During COVID-19, Social Networks and Their Implications for Resilience. So, what first encouraged you to study that topic?
So I didn't. I was actually invited to work on the project after it was started.
Oh.
Yeah. So I guess I'll try to answer as if I was my co-authors, Emily Holt and Susan Keenan, University of Northern Colorado. So they were both teaching right at the time, as basically their department was shifting into remote instruction and kind of seized upon the opportunity. They're like, this is a really cool opportunity to maybe collect some data and see what's going on. And I think that they were getting really interested in doing some kind of social network study. So they knew that they wanted to do something in those regards. And then, of course, right, this whole situation was thrust upon them. And they quickly acted together to start collecting data. Yeah, so I was kind of invited into this, and I was like, yeah, that sounds super fascinating. So once they kind of had the data and they were looking at it, they're like, okay, we should reach out and find someone who can maybe help us think through this. So I was like, yeah, I'd be happy to sit down and work through this with you.
So, out of curiosity, have you worked with your co-authors before, or was this some kind of a random happenstance thing that just worked out?
Yeah, so this was a new collaboration. I'd never worked with them before. I think the background, and I think this actually is one of my favorite things about the study. I gave a workshop on social network analysis in higher education. One of my co-authors was basically a participant in that workshop. So a 4-hour workshop, I was like, you're not going to really learn how to do social network analysis in 4 hours. That's unrealistic. But what I love is to get you started, right? To be thinking about how to do this, how to set up the study, how to get those data, and then, get yourself going. So then, that apparently helped them get the study going. And then I think once they started diving into the data, they're like, oh, okay, well, we should find someone else to do this. And then she reached out to me and I was like, okay, yeah. So I thought that was like a really cool moment, right? It's like, oh, wow. It's like, I ran this workshop and I mean, it came full circle back to me, I guess, but it did something, right? It started a project, and that was a really, really cool thing to see happen. So I was really happy.
So, for our listeners who haven't yet had the chance to read the paper that we're discussing just yet, I would describe this paper as modeling the interactions between both university faculty, so like profs, and graduate students who are working as graduate teaching assistants or GTAs. These interactions show who is sharing things like resources, advice, even emotions, and the idea was to understand how these interactions can contribute to resilience in teaching. Do you have anything else you would like to add onto this description of your study, Dan?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things is the context. So it was the interactions that occurred essentially right after it was announced that all teaching was going to move to remote instruction, right? During I guess it was the winter or spring, depending on where you are, semester of 2020. So what this was capturing was who were people interacting with in that time after the announcement. So it's like 2 weeks after that was announced, right? They had like a week to prepare to move online. I think they were like on spring break or something like that. And it was like, well, as soon as spring break's over, you're remote. You have to figure out how to do that. So I think what was captured was really interesting. It's these interactions that are going on in that time frame, and what are people doing? It's this moment in time where everyone's kind of panicking and trying to figure out what to do and how to do it. And I think that greater context is what made this study exciting.
So a big focus of your paper was based on using exponential random graph models. And these were then further used to create these diagrams called sociographs. For our listeners, a sociograph is kind of like a giant web that has different color and shape-coded pins. And then strings between these different pins represent relationships between different individuals. Do you have anything like to clarify about that image, Dan?
Yeah, so these sociographs, right, these are kind of, it's a picture of a network. It lets you visualize what is related to what, right? And in this case, it's people and different types of interactions regarding teaching that they have with each other over this period of time. But it could be anything, right? You could look at a power grid, or, how you can connect from one city to another, via flights or trains or something like that, right? Those are all networks that can connect with each other. So right, there's a lot of different kind of cool things that you can visualize this way. In some cases, these can be really, really useful because it just gives you an opportunity to look at kind of large scale structures, look at kind of zooming in at kind of more micro level things that are happening. What really stood out to me when we started visualizing these was the fact that most of the interactions that we see really just happen, and it's not surprising, but most of the interactions that we see happen within basically teaching teams. So if there's an instructor or two instructors and a bunch of TAs, there's really dense connections going on there a lot of times, right? And that kind of rules over a lot of, right, if you're going to predict who's talking to who about teaching in this time, it's people who are, teaching the same course together.
Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense. But it was just kind of cool to be like, oh yeah, this is obviously a thing. And there are a lot of studies out there that kind of look at, departmental teaching networks and things like that, and don't really consider that big underlying fact that, if you're teaching with someone, like that is going to predict whether or not you're doing a lot of stuff together. That was the approach.
Speaking of teaching teams, later on in your study, you realized there seems to be more of these kind of isolated interactions between separate groups of faculty members and GTAs that are teaching the same courses. So while most of these are very, very similar in terms of having a high amount of interconnectedness, so, imagine like 4 pins, but there's a web between every single individual. Others are far more isolated with 1 or 2 random floaters and 1 or 2 people who are really focused in the center. Why do you think there's so much variation between these teaching teams?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. This, like, some courses, like everybody was doing everything together. Mm-hmm. Everyone was talking about their emotions. People were co-constructing materials together. And then others, it was just like, no one's doing anything together, right? It's like, basically what that meant was the faculty, whoever was the instructor, just said, okay, TAs, like, I'm just going to take the wheel and do things. And, it's hard. This is something that I wish that we knew more about, right? This is where it's like, these were the data that we had, so we can kind of cast light on something like this, but like actually understanding what was going on would be fascinating. So I can kind of guess based on my conversations largely with my co-authors on this, as far as what was going on from what they have told me. And I think it's a mix of things. So first, a lot of it, I think, depends on what was that course and what were the roles of the TAs. Because the main things that disappeared were the TAs really involved? Were they really interacting with the instructor? Were they interacting with each other? Because, regardless, it's like the instructor is definitely still teaching the course, and the TAs may have some kind of role left, but maybe not, depending on, and that may be reflected in the relationship. So if TAs, their primary role was to set up in-person labs, or just kind of setting those up, then all of a sudden, if those in-person labs are just canceled and the instructor made the decision, okay, we're just not going to really do anything there, those TAs just kind of didn't have anything to do. And my understanding is in some cases that did happen. Like there were TAs who just didn't have anything to do in their class anymore. So that was just kind of like, okay, that's my role. I don't have much to do here.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. It didn't happen to me, but I definitely know some individuals who are in that same boat where they're just kind of like cut adrift and left to fend for themselves.
But you could imagine another class where, right, there's still a lot of grading going on, and the seminars are moved online and they need to be changed and things like that, in which case, right, the TAs are still very involved. But then I think the other thing to think about is, and what I think is the more interesting thing that was going on was just the way that I think the variation in how instructors dealt with the moment. So in some cases, right, and the ones that are super connected, and especially I think the one that illuminates a lot is there's a network where we're asking, who did you co-construct materials with? Right. And that to me is like a really kind of high level interaction. It's not like I'm telling you to do this. It's we need materials, come together like in a meeting and let's together, right, build this, you know, what this class is going to look like. And there were classes where everybody was involved with each other, building materials together. And that is very different, right, as you kind of point out. And like to me, like this is an instructor who is now kind of not just delegating, but like being on the same level and kind of having this kind of vulnerability of like, we're all in this situation and I need your help, right? Like they're willing to kind of step down and do this. And others, right, it was just like, everybody step out of the way, I'm going to just do this.
So later on in the study, you make a point showing that, it might be better to have more delegation and more interconnectedness between members of the teaching team. So if, knock on wood, someone gets COVID, the whole course doesn't just like fall apart if only one individual, has taken the wheel and is driving the course to that point. So with that in mind, do you think it'd be worthwhile to foster more interconnectedness and, I guess, sharing of teaching responsibilities within teaching teams going forward?
I think that would be great. I mean, on a larger point, right, I think that, graduate training needs to involve just kind of more aspects of teaching training in general across the board, right? This is, I think, something that's been discussed more and more and kind of recognized as an important neglected part of graduate training. very frequently, and one that can actually offer a lot of benefits for actually research, and the ability to do research is actually the kinds of things that you can learn from pedagogical training. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how many crises there actually really are, right, that disrupt teaching to this level, but it's certainly helpful, right, to have a lot of people who are capable of stepping up and stepping in a moment where you may need them to. And I think the nature of a lot of academia is like a lot of people seem to be, right, it's like, how do you replace this one person who's supposed to be teaching this whole course if they go down, right, tomorrow, right, and in a seamless way that isn't hyper stressful. And one great way to do that is to kind of have, right, a teaching team that is all aligned together, knowing what's going on, that can kind of pull things together. So I think that that's one model through which this sort, you can kind of be more prepared for these sorts of things to happen, where you have, graduate instructors, right, basically ready, like, and feeling comfortable, and it's not too stressful to say, yeah, you can probably teach this class the next day.
So, zooming out just a little bit, do you think the main lesson of the paper, being that increased interconnectedness is important for resilience, can be applied to other departments, other universities, or perhaps even other countries, or even just not just universities, but say companies?
Yeah, I think big time. And I think the idea to approach this from a resilience framework really came from just other areas that looked at this. So there's work that looked at emergency networks in response to the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, for example, right? And people have kind of looked at what were the calls that were going out between different kind of emergency entities, and like who were really important players, and what was the overall network structure that basically allows a rapid emergency response, right? So the idea to kind of approach it from this framework was borrowed from other applications of thinking about the importance of these kinds of social structures in emergency situations where you have to act quickly. This is very different though, right? Because the way that a university department works, there are kind of, right, official positions and things like that, but there's no like emergency transition to remote instruction, agency within a department per se. So, but there are, and actually that's not entirely true. So if you think about the college here, the College of Biological Sciences, right? So there's the CBS Office for Educational Scholarship and Practice, the COESP. My understanding is as soon as things hit here, so this is before I was here, but my understanding is as soon as remote instruction happened, the COESP started basically having a ton more faculty start coming to talk about teaching and to figure out, how do I transition to remote, right? So in some cases, right, I think what's really interesting is there's a lot of different ways that I think you can be resilient as a college or a university or a department. So you can kind of have these like centralized bodies that are there to try to help, right, facilitate this transition, right? So I think, it'd be really interesting to think about, okay, well, what happened here and how important the COESP must have been in helping a lot of faculty as serving as like this go-to resource.
Oh, for sure. I bet especially for faculty who were kind of more, analog, that suddenly had to transition to the online space and maybe even like completely shake up how their course was taught and the structure of it all. I bet the CoESP was very helpful for them.
Yeah, in the case here, this is, I think, much more just kind of, unstructured. And, part of the title is we're talking about this as a community of practice, where these are just kind of the social interactions that, the social ties and the social resources that you have access to just in general. And there was like no clear, right, centralized body or even person in this case, where it was like, this was the group of people that you go to. It was very like just kind of organic. Everyone just kind of activated whatever relations that they had, whether it was in their teaching teams or, other faculty for whatever reason they're going to each other, friendships, or, this is something that I think, departments, universities, countries, organizations kind of do need to think about, because succeeding through hard times, right, depends on kind of the culture and institutions and structures that you have in place.
So I think we can both agree that having more or like deeper relationships are really important to have, especially when you don't have such a body you can turn to. So what do you think can be done to encourage not the universities, but also companies to really kind of foster that kind of deeper or more relationships?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting and an important question. I think that's something that also, right, a lot of people are just focused on. Because I think organizations, right, they want to nurture, right, the right kind of culture, basically. And I think that's what it really comes down to. It's like, how do you nurture this culture that that makes, the whole greater than the sum of its parts and things like that.
So, taking another further step back, was there anything about this work that particularly surprised you?
I think it was just how interconnected the overall department was. Yeah, I mean, there were people who were like, I guess, just more connected in general than others. But it was, I mean, most people had some kind of connection somewhere. No one was like completely isolated, and no one just totally dominated the network. And a lot of the networks that I've dealt with in the past really do have these like people who are just like, okay, like this is like the person, or these are the people, or this is the institution, right? It's like you remove them and everything changes. Like there really wasn't that in this network. And I think that's really cool. I think it's just really interesting. And it's again, I think it kind of represents this potentially one way, right, that you can express resiliency is, right, kind of having this larger community where it seems like a lot of people feel like they can kind of turn to each other. And now I'm curious, like, is this representative if we were to do this in a bunch more departments, if we could go back and somehow magically collect data from a whole bunch of different departments? Was this overwhelmingly what things looked like, or was this kind of an outlier? I don't know.
Speaking of going back, if you could go back in time, is there anything you'd like to go back and change what you study, and why?
Oh yeah, always. I mean, that's just a fact, right? There's never
always.
Who's ever published a study and not been like, man, I want to go back in time and do this differently, right? Like that's such a rare feeling. I think I would love to just know more about, I mean, all we have in this study and all the data that we have are just structural. So that just means we know who's talking to who's doing what with who. Like I would love to know, right, when we were talking about like the different independent kind of course teams and how different they were, I'd love to know the outcomes of that, right? I'd love to know what was it like to be a TA in this very connected team, and what was it that led to that? And then like in the very disconnected teams, like what's the outcome of that? What did that class look like, right? What were the students' experiences when this happened? So yeah, so there's all kinds of things that I'd love to know.
So, other than building a time machine, what do you think are the next steps for this work?
I think kind of the next steps, specifically like very proximate to this work, would be what are these other relationships, and can we go back and actually see if there's other questions we can ask? I think more broadly, this has really kind of raised an interest in me, similar to kind of what we were talking about as far as the different ways that you can express resiliency. So like, for example, like the co-ESP, right, and the role that it played, understanding that kind of a model would be really interesting. And actually in working with a completely different data set from a completely different university, where it seems like this kind of thing happened, where there is a centralized organization within a larger college, where there's kind of a group of faculty that are kind of very teaching focused. And we actually do have data on what their networks look like before and after the transition to remote instruction in that department. And it looks like early on, at least, that, right, these faculty were absolutely critical in these networks, right? Like it seemed like that's it, having this kind of like these kind of specialized roles, they were like the centralized body that really were important and took on this really big role.
So that's enough questions from me. We're going to take some from social media now. So our first question is, how do we get to know the students we teach virtually and create the same relationships as we would with in-person learning? I mean, certainly there is normally a network being formed between students and their teachers, and it has been, greatly affected by the switch to the virtual format. So do you have any tips for this listener?
Yeah, I mean, again, the way I always think about things, the number one word whenever I think about teaching is structure, right? You want to accomplish something, you structure it into your class as part of the class. So you need to be the person to kind of structure that in, right? And I think there's a lot of different ways that people like to do this. So it's like, if it's a really small class, I've heard of people saying, it's like, well, and you're not teaching a lot of classes. So I think, right, I've heard the advice. It's like, set up a 1 hour meeting with all your students, but that like works in the context of like, I have one, I'm not teaching 4 classes, right? Like I'm not teaching 3 classes. I don't have 1,000 students, right? But I think you really want to show that effort that you do want to get to know your students, right? And I think you can make that assignment like, I want a personal email from you, or you send me something about yourself. But then I think, again, kind of going back to this idea of like vulnerability, safety, things like that, you need to do it too, right? It's like you owe your students information about you. And I think to the extent, right, and to the extent that you can do it one-on-one, the issue is, right, I think with remote instruction that a lot of people are realizing is it becomes so much more one-on-one from a student faculty perspective. But if you have a ton of students, it becomes untenable to really actually maintain really close relations with all your students all the time, things like that. But I think the effort needs to be there, right? It's like, yeah, it's structuring it in and putting in that effort. And I think just there's evidence that just putting in that effort is all that matters.
So, speaking of effort, or rather the perceived lack of effort, here's our next question. How can you create a feeling of accountability when students who bother to sign into class have their cameras and mics off all the time? So, anecdotally speaking, as someone who's been part of teaching teams and even attending conferences, I noticed that many students often, attend less than they would for in-person classes and don't really participate in discussion very much, which often kind of adds to the divide between students and teachers. So how would you recommend, trying to improve that or trying to really reach out to students?
The first thing to practice, I think, is just recognizing how much empathy you need to have, because we don't know what their situation is, right? And we tend to project what we think is going on based on our lived experiences and what we're familiar with onto other people, right? So it's like we'll meet someone new and they'll remind us of someone that we know, and then we'll kind of fill in the blanks on someone that we don't actually know based on someone that we do, right? And I think, right, it's like, it's just this general bias that we have. And I think with students, and especially in the pandemic, right, it's like, we don't know what their situation is. They may not be able to turn their camera on, right? They may not have a suitable background, or right, like they're going to be embarrassed to turn it on. Like there's a million, I think, very legitimate reasons why students may not be able to or be comfortable turning their camera on. So I think like kind of the kind of big background to my response to this is going to be, first, practice empathy and understand that, right, we can't assume that the reasons that students are not doing things are not legitimate. So I think that's kind of one thing. But then there are, right, also I'm on board with the fact that it's like we kind of do want our students to be like engaged and there. And if they can turn their cameras on, we do want their cameras on. We want them to show up to class. We want them to do things. But again, I think that we can structure, right? It's like, how are we structuring our classes if it's just a recorded lecture or we're just talking to them online? What about that structure is telling your students that they need to be there and engaged, right? So you need to structure your class in a way that, again, rewards them for doing the things. And for me, it's always like, points. So can you somehow build points into your class? But I think the really big answer is, make your class as interactive as it can be. If you're trying to do this synchronously, like give them reason to show up.
So that brings us to our last question for today. Do you have any final comments to make about your work? And if our listeners only take away one thing from our chat today, what do you hope it is?
The one thing from our chat, man, I think our chat just diverged. So now I'm just like thinking about all these really great questions. I think I guess to stay on theme, and especially, I think to stay on theme with the talk and with, I guess, the moment, or not the talk, I'm sorry, the paper that we discussed. And I guess the moment in time that we live in is, I guess, really kind of thinking about the importance of social relationships across kind of everything as we move through. And I think, I've been kind of continually frustrated with the idea of, social distancing, because it's physical distancing, right? What we're trying to accomplish here is physical distancing. And I think some people kind of caught on early that this was a bad title. I don't think people totally think that deeply about it, but we shouldn't be socially distancing. We should be physically distancing as needed. But we should be socially as close as we can be right now, because I think we're living in a time where, right, that social closeness continues to be really important. And I think, right, here we're studying a social network where everyone is physically distanced, but they were not socially distanced. And I think that, as we kind of approach things moving forward, I think we kind of need to, work together thinking about the social relations that we do have and how we can nurture them and how we can kind of rely on them to help kind of support everybody through what continues to be a, difficult time in humanity. So, yeah.
So carry on. Yeah. That's all we can really do. Yeah. Carry on. And so that brings us to the end of today's podcast. A big thanks again to our guest, Dr. Dan Grunspan, for joining us today. Griffincast is brought to you by your host, me, Michael Lim, with editing assistance from Ian Smith. If you're hungry to learn more about different science topics, please check out Scribe Research Highlights. That's Scribe, SCRIBE, Research Highlights on the University of Guelph website at uofguelph.ca. Or you can follow us on social media at U of GCBS. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Music in the podcast comes from Bosnow on Uppbeat. There'll be details in the show notes. And until next time, please stay curious.